Okay, if I can now move on, we're going to ask Jessica and Will to come and join us. Morning Jessica, morning Will, how are you? Welcome. You know the inquiry we're undertaking. Thank you for sparing the time to come along to advise us this morning. Is there anything you'd like to begin by saying?
Sure, yeah, we do have an opening statement, which is that we'd like to thank the committee very much for inviting us to give evidence. It's an extremely pressing problem, as you all know, and it's also a very complex problem, voter disengagement. So our evidence is around the solutions to the voter disengagement is going to range across a whole different, a very wide variety of areas. So the commitment from this committee on voter disengagement is very welcome, but we need commitment from all sorts of other areas as well, including government, the rest of Parliament, schools, civil society, media. So we need a combination of public policy, institutional reform, and cultural change, all driven by a relentless focus on what will re-engage the public in politics.
Jessica, you have nothing to add?
That sounds like it.
Okay, Paul, over to you.
You state in your evidence that low voter turnout, I quote, has a high cost for decision making. How?
Well, obviously in a representative democracy, legitimacy is conferred through election, and I think the general assumption is that would be the majority of people, much more than 50%. I think it has a cost for both governments and citizens. I mean, if you look to Europe, there's been a trend to farm out political decisions to unelected technocrats, and that's had some pretty bad consequences. It's a problem for the citizen because whilst a technocrat might make the most efficient decision, it's not democratic, it's not necessarily in the public interest. Of course, what that does is
would you explain this to the people in Rome, that when they had very high turnouts for a whole multiplicity of parties, that produced better government than they got being run by the technocrats?
No, it doesn't always produce better government, but the issue here is confidence in decision making. And what you get is an increase in the gap. If voters, getting back to the turnout issue, people vote when there's high stakes, when they feel their vote's going to make a difference. And if the person you're electing isn't making that decision, that's obviously going to have an impact on you. So you can see a bit of a vicious circle created there.
The percentage of people who voted in 2010 were a good 5%, up 65%, compared to 59% in 2001. Has that resulted in a happier, efficient democracy?
That's a big question. I mean, the rise in turnout at the 2010 election was obviously because the contest was much closer. That's a really big turnout. I mean, we, the Electoral Reform Society, don't see an inherent problem in coalition governments. We think they can be very positive for democracy. So I'll leave that answer there, I think.
The people who've decided to vote are usually those who have the strongest motivation and probably the best informed. Will it be helpful to get those who are less well informed and probably more susceptible to the pleadings of the tabloid press to engage them in voting? Do you think we'd improve the quality of government with 100% of people, a large number of whom have no deep commitment to the issues or no great knowledge of them?
I think, sorry, do you want to...
Well, I was just going to say that I think that it's kind of a founding principle of democracy that there's an equality of participation, that all votes are equal, and I don't think that there should be... I think it'd be a mistake to see some votes or some people who might vote as inherently more valuable than others.
I mean, would you be in favour of when the demise of the Queen takes place by abdication or death, that we should exercise democracy to elect her successor and choose between Charles, William or any other? Wouldn't this be a final
elect the monarch?
Maybe putting his name into that one.
I think that's straying a little bit from our submission and our policies there. Yes, we think democracy is a good thing, but I'm not sure we would stray into Republican conversation about it.
Why? Why is that? I mean, you're advocates of 100% turnout.
No, I mean we're
democratic decisions on everything. No?
We're not in favour of 100% turnout in any sort of forced way. We would echo Ruth's comments on compulsory voting. We do feel that in a representative democracy, which we have, that you want a large majority of people to take part in that, and equally as well.
Your written submission also calls for some wider reforms to the culture and practices of representative democracy. And one of the ones you suggest is tackling the adversarial nature of Westminster politics. I can recall when I was a young man, one of my great heroes referring to the opposition to his party as being lower than vermin. While it was a gratuitous insult to vermin, it seemed to strike a political nerve. And I can remember someone from the, greatly revered figure of Churchill saying in the House when he was accused of being drunk by a lady member that, Madam, I'm drunk, but you're ugly, and by tomorrow I'll be sober. Now, these insults have been part of the... yes. I mean, why should adversarial politics add some life and colour? I mean, can you imagine the pulses of the nation being hastened and quickened by this committee rather than what happened in the insults in the chamber yesterday?
I think that, of course, adversarial politics does provide great anecdotes and often good copy for newspapers and the press and so on. It's Ruth Fox's organisation has just done a study of Prime Minister's questions and has found that people are genuinely turned off by that culture. And I think, no one wants to see... Sorry?
They watch it if they're turned off.
Well, not that many people watch it. I think it does hit the news. It hits the news bulletins, and so it has a very important place in the public imagination of politics. But I don't think many people are tuning in at 12 o'clock on a Wednesday. And I think no one wants to have a completely anodyne political culture where there's no real debate or opposition. But there's a clear desire from the public to tone down adversarialism. And there are various ways that you can do that.
You also suggest reforming the electoral system. If we look at the one of the most recent measures of public opinion we had, and that was a vote on the alternative vote, which was decided by a placard on Vauxhall Bridge, like crossed every morning, and saying if you're in favour of AV, you're in favour of more babies dying in hospital and more of our soldiers dying in Afghanistan. I mean, I don't exaggerate. The suggestion was it was going to cost money, there should be a cut, and the cut would be in hospital facilities for young babies and for body armour for our troops in Afghanistan. Do you think this is a fine example of democracy in action and fully informed voters who voted on AV?
No, I mean, I think we could probably fill the rest of this session with discussion about the pros and cons of that campaign and some of the publicity that came out of it.
Doesn't it shake your faith in democracy and having... I mean, the more people who voted in that, the top sort of 30% who don't vote normally, might well find that argument plausible. And AV was little understood, I would suggest, in that election. The chances of getting a real argument about the advantages or otherwise of AV were lost in the media babble and the tabloid nonsense.
Yeah, we would have much rather have seen a more full debate on the pros and cons of voting change, and widening that out to a question of how people engage with Parliament. There's an issue there which I think Ruth mentioned about levels of interest and knowledge being very much tied into whether people turn out to vote, and when there's no space in the media or anywhere else for the full facts to be debated, then that obviously does turn people off.
I mean, how would you react to Russell Brand telling young people that that they shouldn't vote? Remembering that Russell Brand has 7 million followers on Twitter, which is rather more than we members of the committee have on amongst our followers.
Put together.
All put together, all politicians in Western Europe, I would have thought, put it together.
Yeah.
is this the way forward? I mean, do you think that it's legitimate for Russell Brand to do that? What effect will it have? I mean, how could that be countered?
I think Russell Brand's interventions are a really good example of the sort of pros and cons of celebrity interventions in this debate. I think what he said it gave a lot of oxygen to the issue, and that's quite important. And it's at a time when the issue is becoming more and more serious, but at the same time, his recommendation is not very helpful. So I think with some celebrity interventions in general, I think anything that brings that helps to bring focus to politics and helps to focus minds and brings attention is good, but you just need to be careful.
I mean, he does, and he is attempting to focus minds on traditional drug policies and advocating a policy that's happening in Uruguay and Colorado and Washington at the moment. So I mean, do you think that, and by trying to get people to sign petitions to get rid of our 42 years of utterly failed drug prohibition in this country, do you think he's right to say, well, don't vote in general elections, but sign petitions?
Well, there's clearly an irony in that development, in which he's told people not to be involved in politics and has then moved swiftly on to talking about politics himself and the sorts of politics which is dealt with here in Westminster and representative democracy. So yeah, there's clearly an irony there. But I don't think Russell Brand should be dominating this conversation.
We've got a vote in this House at 5 o'clock tonight, on which I think all members have had hundreds of emails in. Do you think MPs are more likely to be voted by the petitions, by the emails that have come in, rather than by what happened to us in 2010, when the electorate were wise enough to choose us?
I think the public are choosing to use more direct methods of engagement, and I think in 2011 it was the number of people contacting their MP online rather than on the phone or through ring letters exceeded traditional forms for the first time. So there's more people contacting MPs online than anywhere, and I'm sure you'll know from your own inboxes that it's quite a very popular way of exercising some sort of political voice. Whether one way or other is more important is a wider question. I think the more ways you can involve the public between elections it can really help boost engagement, interest and knowledge. But obviously in a representational system it can never be more important than the election, of course.
And one of the problems is that the single issue campaigns in isolation are problematic for representative democracy, whereas if people are parts of associations of any kind, unions, churches, political parties, and they're having to prioritise the issues that they care about and decide which ones they want to give most of their focus to, then that creates a more representative version of collective decision making, and that gives people the experience. But of course, over time, membership of that kind of associations has dropped, and people's sort of individualism and consumerist culture has risen, which has made single-issue campaigning of this sort much more prevalent. And that's one of the problems that political parties and government has to deal with.
Finally, two groups have given evidence to us, have urged that the voting age be reduced to 16 and that voting is made compulsory. What's your view?
Well, we strongly support vote to 16. We don't think this is going to solve the whole turnout problem, but we do think it could help. One of the reasons for that is it obviously brings the gap between when you learn about voting and elections and democracy at school to actually being able to exercise that vote. So obviously depending on where your birthday falls, it could be a good 7 years almost between leaving formal education and actually exercising your vote for the first time. And as we've heard from many other contributors, that age group of people tend to be in private rented accommodation. They're moving about more, so they're more difficult to get registered, and there's problems following on from that. We don't support making it compulsory for first-time voters. I would support what Dr. Fox says in the sense that is probably more likely to turn them off politics than anything else. We don't think they should be treated as political apprentices or a separate section of the democratic society.
Yeah. Okay, very quickly, thank you.
Fabian?
Thank you very much. Can I move on to inequality of turnout? Because we've had evidence given to us previously that the inequality of registration and turnout is a more serious issue than low turnout generally. And your written submission says that, and I quote, inequalities in voter registration seriously undermine the principle of democratic representation. I wondered if you could both expand on this point, please.
Sure. I mean, I think it's fairly obvious that in a good democracy, everyone participates as equally as possible. The particular problem with inequalities in turnout registration is they do seem to be affecting one group, and that is young people. And that is a problem for the future of democracy. Obviously, people do get into a habit of voting. So if you vote the first time or early on, you tend to vote again and again for the rest of your life.
Why votes at 16 are so important, of
Absolutely.
course,
yeah. But if you don't, you develop this sort of expectation of non-participation, and that tends to be reinforcing. So if you don't vote the first time, if the cohort you belong to isn't listened to, if you don't see your views represented in policy or in political debates, then you're less likely to feel that politics has anything to do with you, and that sort of reinforces the not wanting to participate the next time. So you can see that trend. I mean, I could see us sat here in 10 years' time addressing the same questions, but with much lower turnout and much greater equality, because of course that gap is expanding.
And the other major inequality is inequality in turnout is socioeconomic status, and that's a real problem. And it's also there was a time when that wasn't the case. Certainly in the US. Data, historical data over a long period of time shows that back in the 19th century you were more likely to vote if you were of lower socioeconomic status than not. So that's a really important problem.
How do you explain that inequality? Because I represent a constituency which is part of the city of Leeds, which has a very, very poor and mainly immigrant area to the south. And as you progress up the road, it's like a pie slice. It gets progressively better off, more middle class, and then quite wealthy. And we do see huge inequalities in turnout in the poorest areas. I mean, it's almost reflected by socioeconomic class and family and household income. But how do you explain that? Is it simply because more people are moving about? Is it because this is the least priority in people's lives if they're struggling to put food on the table? I mean, what is the explanation for that lack of interest?
I think there's many factors. I think both of those are quite important. I think we also have to look at the cultural politics. We look at Parliament. Do people look to Parliament and say, that's really representative of me, I can identify with Parliament? Do people see themselves represented at Parliament? I think that's a big question that they'd be asking. So I think that's how representative Parliament is, plays a big role in it as well.
But wouldn't you have thought, though, that the more people are struggling because they see the whole economy as being unfair and distribution of wealth being unfair, that they might want to actually change it. They might have more reason to want to change what's going on through the political process, and therefore there's something wrong with the political process rather than who represents them. Because I think, my experience is most parliamentarians of all parties do their very best to represent the people that have elected them to the best of their ability. Now, they may not reflect them in terms of class or race or religion or gender, but actually they try and represent everybody, because that's the principle that underlines British parliamentary representation, as opposed to many other countries which have list systems or anonymous faces.
As Dr. Fox was saying earlier, there's a real problem with efficacy, the perception that your vote makes a difference, and lots of voters in safe seats are going to struggle to see the point. And if they have lots of other pressures on their time and resources, if they have limited resources, the point of voting is going to be harder to understand. So I think that's part of the problem.
Well, let me just finally, Chair, challenge you on that, because I would say you've got quite an old-fashioned view. Maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, you could say, yes, there were safe seats for each of the parties, and actually it didn't matter what the MP did, they were always going to get elected. But I would say that's changed hugely in the last 10 or 15 years, don't you?
No, actually, the number of marginal seats has gone down.
Really?
Yeah.
And you've got the evidence?
I haven't got the figures to hand, but I can certainly send it to committee, because there's an actual fact that the way you measure marginals, the number of seats that can be swung within a certain percentage has gone down.
Well, I'd very much like to see that evidence.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Chair.
Mark, we're very grateful you've landed in this country, and the first thing you do is come to the Select Committee, which I think is a great tribute to us. Thank you, Mark.
Well, just slightly over 12, just 12 hours and 10 minutes ago. So to be here. In terms of, okay, we're having this inquiry because we're all taking it as a given that there is lower voter turnout. We have talked and we've received evidence about some of the worrying effects of lower turnout, particularly if that continues. Causes of lower turnout. What is actually causing, in your view?
One way of looking at it is that you have short-term causes and long-term causes, and what you're getting at the moment is a kind of perfect storm between those two ranges. So that with short-term, in the short term, we've had a whole series of crises and scandals, the expenses scandal, cash for honours, and also wider scandals around elites generally, not just in Parliament, but in the media and banks and so on. And that has been the sort of fuse to light these long-term cultural changes, societal changes, which are really deeply entrenched and more or less impossible to shift. So you have globalization, which creates the sense that politicians' ability to shape society is less than it was, and that feeds through into the public. They feel that that politics is less efficacious than it was. Then you have changes in societal cultures. You have a rise of consumerism. You have a more autonomous and more highly educated population, which is less willing to be represented or told what to do, or is much less deferent. And so you have these sort of long-term changes which militate against people finding politics, formal politics, something to engage in. And so when you have these long-term changes lit by the fuse of short-term changes, that's why we have something approaching a crisis in voter engagement at the moment.
And so it's basically just because of that switch off, the powerlessness, the irrelevance, the finality of politics. It's those sorts of perceptions. Anything to do with the methods of voting, and do you think changing the voting methods would make a difference to voter engagement?
Yes, I mean, people turn out to vote when the stakes are high and when the contest is close, and so there's obviously a per election impact there as well. Obviously, you don't turn out to vote if you don't think it's going to make any difference. So we will, of course, say that a change in the electoral system is quite important for that. But these are big changes, and they're happening all across the world. In fact, you do see the countries that Scandinavian, Nordic countries that tend to have higher turnouts. They have really, really rigorous registration. So that is obviously a factor there. But they also have different political cultures, so they're not as affected by some of the things which might be affecting British turnout.
You done, Mark?
Yeah.
Okay. Fabian. Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
Chris, you did.
Yeah.
You wanted to come in quickly.
Just to point
Forgive me.
to Will there, you said that those who are university educated, for the most part, don't want to be told what to do. Was that correct?
Well, it's a generalisation, but it's the higher levels of education generally, not necessarily university education,
right.
but higher levels of education generally, over 70, 80, 90 years.
But the differentials between voter turnout for the educated, university educated, the ABs, and the non-university education, the DEs, is massive.
Sure.
So how do you square that?
Well, I think it's not a direct relationship between university education and not wanting to vote. It's more that higher levels of education, generally in the population, not just higher education itself, but standard education, have created an entire cultural shift. So it's the sheer difference between 1930s, 1920s. Society and the 21st century society. It's very, very different in terms of how people relate to authority, to government, to the perception of their own self-worth or their own autonomy. People have a much stronger sense of self-worth and that's a long-term cultural shift, and it makes it harder for them to accept the idea of being represented in Parliament or giving over their power, as it were, to a representative.
And secondly, you mentioned the issue of trust and stuff like that, and inequality. Joseph Stiglitz, in his book The Price of Inequality, there's a whole chapter, chapter 5, on democratic deficit, and he makes a link that the economic inequality and political inequality go hand in hand, and it's not just something that's happened, it's something that's been construed, it's something that's been designed. He's talking in an American setting, but he points to issues like in Republican states putting forward photo ID before you go to the to vote. A whole range of barriers put in place to keep poor people, blacks and Hispanics, to keep them off the register. And in fact, I think in American law, it's okay to keep a person off the register if they're a Democrat, but it's not okay to keep a person off the register if they're black. And he said that the whole system in America has been manipulated, deliberately, party politically manipulated, to keep the poorest off the register, to keep the poorest off voting, from voting. Are we seeing an element of that in the UK, with the media, with judges, with senior politicians, dripping the issue of security, voter security, whilst neglecting the fact that there are 6.5 million people off the register, not even on the register, and 11 million people that don't vote? What's your views on that?
I think most people would say that we have nowhere near the kinds of problems that America has on that front. On the other hand, there are certain political.
Are you aware that the Electoral Commission is proposing to introduce photo ID in 2019, which has been introduced by Republican states in America?
We have some concerns about that, but not so much because we think it's gerrymandering the system, but because we think it's putting up barriers to voting, and any barriers in the current state of affairs is problematic in our view. But I would say that political inequality is not so much that I think in this country there are certainly cases in which political inequality, the inequality in turnout, shapes public policy. So the fact that young people don't turn out to vote as much as older people has been shown to shape public policy.
So they get the tripling of tuition fees. They don't vote triple tuition fees.
Not to be specific about it, I think the Intergenerational Foundation found have a whole set of data on that. So similarly, there are always going to be dangers with inequality in turnout, that those who don't turn up are going to get left out. So.
Jessica?
Yeah, I was going to say as well, it is always a matter of balance, and you mentioned earlier about the postal votes, and we would really strongly advise against getting rid of postal votes or any sort of retrograde step, because, as you say, the really important thing is the number of people off the register, and the case of fraud are very small. So where we are seeing election process tightened up, we'd want to see a balance there, and that they're not the big issue of under registration, low turnout is really the key focus.
Okay. Fabian?
Can I continue the theme that Mark Durkin started, really, about modernising electoral administration? Now, you've proposed various reforms to modernise electoral administration. I wonder if you could outline the main changes that you think would improve voter engagement.
Sure. I mean, we've put down election day registration, and I put that first today, because that is the one reform that has been shown to improve equality of voting most. So in the US, where that's been introduced, it's been shown to have the highest impact on people who move home regularly. So we know those are the people who are less likely to register and less likely to vote.
Sorry, can I just be clear on that? So if you turn up at the polling station and you're not on the register, you can actually...
You can still vote.
You can still vote?
Yes.
How can you ensure that there isn't fraud there, then?
How can we ensure there's not fraud?
There's no fraud.
Right, well in the US the way they do it is with identification,
right,
plus you sign an oath, you declare an oath face to face with the registration officer there, and then they do an audit afterwards as well, just to check up on that. Okay. But in the presidential election, last one, of the top 5 states for voter turnout, 4 of them had same-day registration.
Okay. Well, that sounds, is that the only one?
Sorry, no. I'll go on.
No, please do, yeah, that sounds good.
We also very much like the idea of motor voter style registration, which we'll have to find a better name for, but this is where you would be encouraged to vote with your government transactions, so with your council tax, when you apply for a driving licence, different sort of state interactions you would be encouraged to and given a form to register. Lots of people think they're already registered when they pay their council tax, so it wouldn't be a massive leap there. And in our research we found at least 38% of people felt they'd be more likely to register with that sort of encouragement.
Well, that seems very sensible. I wonder why it hasn't been done already.
Yeah. One of the things which would be really innovative, if we had vote 16, you could send the registration form out with your national insurance number card, which is you become a citizen in the eyes of the state in 2 ways. So.
Yeah. Okay. Any other?
Yes, I've mentioned early registration.
Yeah.
I mean, a larger change, but one which would be worth thinking about, is allowing voters to vote anywhere in their constituency. So at the moment, obviously, you have to go to your specific polling station, and I'm sure you can think of all the administrative changes that this might occur. But if you think about it in connection with same-day registration, if you're registering on the day and you don't have your poll card, being able to turn up anywhere would be a massive boost as well. I mean, in New Zealand, you can vote anywhere in the country on election day, but that's because the returns don't come in until much later. They don't declare the election until later.
The only problem, I mean, I agree with all your suggestions, and it's certainly worth looking at that last one. The only problem is that for all of us in this room who rely on the accurate data from polling districts to see where our strengths and weaknesses lie, I don't think the political parties will be too happy about it.
No.
But I think, my view is if it increases voter registration and participation in elections, it's a sacrifice worth making.
Parties can evolve.
Yeah.
Sorry?
All I would
Parties can evolve.
Yes, well, that's very true.
And all I would say to that is it's, I guess, how you look at the system, in whose interest is it working, and we would say make sure the system works in the interest of the voter first, and that could mean some big scale changes.
Absolutely right. Thank you, Jen.
Chris?
The Electoral Commission was started in, I think, 2001. Up until 2011, it didn't know how many people were unregistered, or it had the wrong figure. They thought 3.5 million. In 2011, their research revealed it was 6 million. I mean, I told them 2 years prior to that it was 6 million, after having a meeting with Experian, who told me. So, and you mentioned before about the balance between security of the vote and the size of the electorate. Do you believe the Electoral Commission has got that balance right? Do you think there's an over-focus on security of the vote, putting back on political parties, touching postal votes, introduction of photo ID, even before the new changes have been bedded down? Do you think the balance is right between within the Electoral Commission? Could they do more on voter turnout? They're great at saying you should do this box, and you should send out this form, but they don't. They measure all the inputs, but they don't actually measure the outputs. How many people have been registered in a local authority or nationally? Didn't even have the figures. Is the balance right?
I think the introduction of IR has obviously raised a lot of issues here, and it has raised the issue of millions unregistered, and I think that's been quite a good catalyst to look at obviously the role of the Electoral Commission and also ways of getting people registered. So obviously the Electoral Commission has had more of a focus on compliance and regulation, and we would like to see a more positive focus on issues like registration and turnout. But the Electoral Commission has undertaken and is going to be doing a huge marketing campaign when IR starts coming in later this year, and I think that's something worth looking at and evaluating to see if it could be continued.
Yeah. Are you aware of the outputs, the campaigns, the electoral registration campaigns that the Electoral Commission has run in the past, and they judge it by the downloads from their website? In 2005, having spent I think £3.5 million on advertising, each download cost £80. On average, it's £25. The best was £5 per download in 2010 general election. So it's an average. Bite the bullet. can do it for 18 pence. Is there a case for more efficient use of public money, whether it be through the Electoral Commission or through the Cabinet Office, for the purpose of electoral registration? Should we be working closer with groups on the grounds that have got those connections in those communities, or with that cohort, or with that demographic? Should we be using the Electoral Commission having greater focus on this, on value for money?
Well, Bite the Ballot do an enormous amount of work on
pittance.
very small, absolutely, and it's there. If you've met them, I'm sure their enthusiasm for getting young people registered is absolutely infectious. So
Is that enthusiasm tapped by the Electoral Commission, by the Cabinet Office or Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, I know that the Cabinet Office is obviously engaged by the ballot in doing some work, and I think that's really exciting, and you know, if it works, it should carry on. Their national voter registration there is a brilliant idea. We were involved with that, and those sorts of initiatives, the sort of bottom-up stuff, I think is fantastic for getting people registered. I do think you need that top-down approach as well, and the Electoral Commission have got the national focus and are in a position to be able to really push.
Have they been effective in getting people on the register? There's 6.5 million people accept off the register after 13 years of existence of the EC. Acceptable.
The problem, of course, is that getting people on the register is localised. So you know, there's no national register. Each ERO does their own thing, and some are amazing. You know, they get 90+ registration in inner city areas that would traditionally be, you know, very, very difficult to register people. And then there are others which you could say would have an easier job, who have very low registration rates. So there's obviously a big difference in how well each local authority is getting people on the register.
Who should monitor the poor performance? Who should monitor and invigilate and punish the poor performance of electoral registration officers? Because some of them, every ERO is supposed to organise a door-to-door canvass for those who haven't registered. I think it's called Priority 3. There are 55 local authorities that haven't done this. Some of them haven't done it for 4 years on the trot. And the Electoral Commission, I'm not sure if it has the ability to sanction them, but no action has been taken against these local authorities that do it. So we've got best performance and we've got worst performance, and some of them are making no improvements. What can be done? Is it the job of the Electoral Commission? Is it the job of government departments? Could that be a recommendation that this committee makes? That vigilation, the raising of standards has to be more vigorous and more properly implemented.
Yes, I mean, I think given the rates of under-registration, there does need to be a very serious focus on it. But I do think it takes targeted action from all number of people involved in this area.
Who?
Electoral Commission, obviously, local registration officers, groups. You know, we can't put too much pressure on civil society groups who, as we were saying, are doing a huge amount for very little, but they can encourage it. But we would like to see a focus on the positive signs of signing people up rather than just on the negative elements.
Okay.
Great. Any other questions from colleagues? And anything you'd like to add, Jessica or Will, to what you've said this morning, which has been very helpful? Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for your time, and very good to see you. And we'll hopefully get our report together in the not too distant future on what is an absolutely vital topic, as we are now 418 days away from the next general election. But who's counting? Thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Thank you, colleague.